a place to go. Okay, so he goes to this widow's house and tells her, "Make me some bread." And she's like, "I don't have any bread. I only have a small amount of flour and a small amount of oil left for me and my son to eat and die." They were living in poverty, basically. So Elijah tells her, "Go make me bread, and that flour and that oil will never run out." And exactly what he said happened. She goes and makes him bread, and the pots of oil and flour are filled. The second miracle he does, and I believe this is one of the very few times that someone is brought back to life. He bring the widow's son that he stayed at the house of. Her son dies from a sickness, and she goes crying and weeping to Elijah. Elijah goes back to her house and prays and brings her son back to life. So this is a prophet that God bestowed power on. He gave him he gave him talents of basically healing, control over weather. You've never, like, people don't see this, people don't hear about this, right? This is a prophet that came from God and has all this power. And the drought, by the way, is still going on during those miracles. But then Elijah goes and tells one of the other prophets to tell Ahab that he wants to meet him, and he tells him about ending the drought. And basically, let's see, I think it's 18. Okay, so basically, this is another great miracle of Elijah. Elijah has Ahab gather all the peoples, okay, as many people as possible, and has him gather the priests of Baal, the god of the Sidonians, or the Canaanites, because Baal was a Canaanite and Sidonian god. He has them. He has them build an altar to Baal, and then he tells the people to build him an altar the way he prescribed, which is the way that is in the book of the law to burn sacrifices to God. It says here that Elijah told them, "Go first, call on Baal, burn up the burnt sacrifice on the altar," and they spend the entire day calling on Baal to send fire from heaven and burn up that sacrifice. To show God's power even more, after he waited all that time, he tells the people of Israel, "Bring water, fill up, cover that altar in water, make a trench around it of water," and they keep dumping water on it a few times. All right, then he prays, and God sends fire to burn up the altar that Elijah was burning, had a sacrifice for God on. So his miracles are outstanding. These are things that have not been seen till that day. Yes, there was great prophets before Moses. The miracles Moses did himself were awesome, especially the Red Sea, the parting of the Red Sea. But for someone to tell weather to stop and bring a child back to life, and the other miracles he would do, that was such a big deal, and it's a big deal to a lot of people in the faith today. And I'm gonna explain why in a second. But going on, Ahab is condemned. After this, I'm sorry, I skipped a part. After this incident of the fire on the altar, Jezebel threatens to kill Elijah. Okay, and I think a few people might have talked about this before in meetings here. she threatens to kill Elijah and she kills all the prophets of God and everyone else, and Elijah escapes. Okay? Elijah goes up on a mountain. God sends him there. He feeds him. He gives him water. But Elijah is like in a place where someone could say he was basically becoming hopeless, but he really wasn't. He just was done. Like he had no more energy to fight with Jezebel and Ahab. So God takes him up and basically to this mountain, and God gives him commands. He tells him, Elisha you're gonna consecrate him as, a prophet, and he gives him other people to consecrate, like Jehu, which we'll read about, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So after this meeting, Israel is attacked by Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria. So I don't know if anybody remembers the map I had up a couple of weeks ago. There wasn't really any Syria there, right? The nations were starting to be developed, and some of these nations are still named today what they were back then. So there's this king of Syria. He's preparing to attack the northern kingdom, okay? And basically, Elijah prays to God, and God told them that you will overcome their armies, which they do, okay? Which they do. But God also told them to get rid of all the evil in the land, which they didn't. Ben-Hadad decides to go to Ahab and basically, I would say kind of asking for forgiveness, but they end up making a treaty. All right? So Elijah goes to Ahab and condemns him the first time. All right? But it doesn't stop there. Ahab doesn't stop there, even though he tells him that God is angry, that you've broken God's law, and he gives him warnings and signs of things to come. He gets condemned, and this is in 1 Kings chapter 21. Later on, he wanted a vineyard. Okay, he was like, I guess, traveling through his country and decided he wants a specific vineyard. All right, and I'm talking about Ahab here, King Ahab. He goes and asks the owner, "Can I buy this vineyard from you? Any price you want?" And the owner is like, "This is a vineyard that belonged to my ancestors. Why would I give it to you?" Okay, so Ahab is angry about it. Jezebel decides to have the governors of the area where Naboth, who owned that vineyard, lived. She goes and tells him to have him killed. All right, kill him so she can take the vineyard, because if you kill him, it's easier for them to come and claim the land. All right? So she does that, Jezebel, Ahab's wife. So basically, Ahab is condemned again and judged, as well as Jezebel. Okay? And Ahab later on dies in a battle against the very country he made a treaty with, which was Ben-Hadad and Syria. But even worse, Jezebel gets condemned, and we're going to see that as we move forward. While those events were happening, though, you guys remember the city of Jericho that was condemned by God? Joshua was basically put the city in ruins, and he cursed it. So I'm going to go back real fast. And there's a point to this. Joshua 6:26. And Joshua says here, "Then Joshua charged them at that time, saying, 'Cursed be the man before the Lord who rises up and builds this city, Jericho. He shall lay its foundations with the firstborn, and with the youngest he shall set its gaze. So with his firstborn, basically his firstborn, the firstborn of that person who rebuilds the foundation of Jericho, his life will be taken, and the youngest. When the gates are built, the youngest child's life will be taken. This city was basically cursed, and this was all happening, by the way, during the time of Ahab and Elijah. This city was cursed because of the sinful and evil nature that this city was living in. It wasn't just by chance that Israel walked through that area and knocked down Jericho. No, this was God's plan. God's plan was to remove evil, as we said a couple of weeks ago. So that was Joshua's curse. When we go to Kings 16, 1 Kings 16, and this is actually talking about Ahab, this whole chapter, but it mentions this piece, okay, because Hiel, who rebuilt Jericho, was very close to Ahab, and this is why this is mentioned. So it says here, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. He laid its foundations with Abiram, his firstborn, and with his youngest son, Segob. He set up its gates according to the word of the Lord, which he had spoken through Joshua, the son of Nun. So God's words, God's promises, God's curses, you would say. It's not that God cursed it. It was Joshua who laid that curse, but because God told him what's going to happen if it's rebuilt. These things came true. And everyone in Israel is seeing this, including Ahab. He's seeing all this. All right? So it cost this person 2 of his children. And then we go on with Ahab's life. He dies in the battle with king of Syria. And before I continue, the reason why Ahab's life, it's actually, I believe it's over 2 or 3 chapters, his life. His life story talks a lot about a man who is just lost altogether. And I was telling you before, he understood his faith. The kings understood what their faith is. If faith is, they understood the laws of Israel. They had laws that they had to follow, but they decided not to follow them, like Ahab. Ahab decided to go an entirely, completely different way. We don't know if it's because he fell in love with Jezebel and she misled him, or what exactly happened. We do know he did fall in love with her. He married her and then ends up bringing her gods over. We just don't know where that all started. Okay? He basically led himself to his own destruction. Okay? He led himself to a place where none of us ever want to be. And I'm not talking about destruction physically, I'm talking about spiritually. To go as far as taking a vineyard that was obtained by blood, by murder. That tells you a lot about a person and where they are at this point of their life. This is why Jeremiah focuses a bit on Ahab and his story, because his story was one that would teach us a lesson as people. And he, at the time when he was writing, he was trying to teach the people of Israel this lesson of what happened to Ahab and where his sins led him. Even Jezebel, when Ahab dies, Jehu becomes, later on he would become king. He was appointed by God to become king. And he would go and basically have Jezebel killed, all right, and then throws her body on the very vineyard, which Elijah had already told Ahab is going to happen. Throws her body on the very vineyard that they took from the man they murdered, and let the dogs feed on her body. Literally, that's what God said would happen, and that's what ends up happening. And it's, if you think about it, don't take it in a literal sense, take it in a spiritual sense. Because like I was saying, it sounds like history, but it's really lessons. Jeremiah is putting lessons in there for us to learn. These are people who lived, committed these acts, and there was an outcome. And this is what we need to learn from as Christians. We need to look into these details. Elijah, at the end of his life, after he takes care of the business, God had asked him to go, consecrate Elisha as prophet and Jehu as king, and so forth. Elijah is one of two people who ends up ascending to heaven on a chariot of fire. He never actually died. Does anybody know who the second person is? Well, actually, he's the second person. Does anybody know who the first person that ascended to heaven without dying? Enoch, Adam's son. Later on in Revelation, if we read this on Bright Saturday, and I'm sure people read it at home, there's two people that will come back to earth, and they will fight the dragon. Biblical scholars believe that will be Enoch and Elijah, who will come back, fight the dragon, and the dragon will kill them, which is Satan. He'll kill them, and their bodies will be left out in the open for the world to see. This is all in Revelation. So Elijah ascends, and before he ascended up to heaven, he asked Elisha who would be the next prophet after him. So God already had him consecrate Elisha as the next prophet, the leader of the prophets. There wasn't just one. There was multiple prophets in Israel, but there was always a leader. And basically, he asked Elisha, what do you want from me before I go? And Elisha was like, I want a double portion of your spirit. Okay? Because that's how Elijah was. He had power that God gave him. He had that strength. He was more than a leader. He was like John the Baptist. If you read the stories of John the Baptist in the New Testament, he speaks out and he does it as if he had authority, and that authority was given to him by God. That's what Elijah was. Okay, he was powerful. So Elisha wanted that. He wanted that strength, and he wanted that power, so he can continue the mission that Elijah started in Israel. And then moving forward, there's another story in Kings that I thought might actually benefit us. Naaman's leprosy. And this is in 2 Kings chapter 5. So at the time, I remember someone asking me this question 2 weeks ago about God wanting to destroy all the peoples and the lands. Why is God wanting Israel to kill everyone? It's not that he wanted that. It's he wanted to remove evil. But it was also Israel's job to accept those who wanted to come and learn about the faith and become part of the faith. Okay, it's like us today. We have missionaries. We go out, talk to people about Christianity. They had that same job. It was something God wanted. He wanted people to learn about him. He wanted people to know his laws, to know who he was. So Naaman, a commander from the army of king of Syria, becomes leprous. Okay, and basically, the king of Syria goes to the king of Israel and says, or he sends a letter to the king of Israel and says, I'm sending my servant Naaman to be healed, right? At the time, the king of Israel thought he's just trying to cause trouble. So he can send his servant back and say, oh, he did nothing for us, or he hurt his servant, or whatever. Anyway, he goes, Elisha hears about this, right? And Elisha goes and tells him to wash in the Jordan 7 times, and his flesh will be restored. Naaman obviously says, he says something. Actually, I'll read that for you. But he says something about the waters in his country compared to Israel. Um, uh, so actually, he says something different. He says, "Indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and heal their leprosy." And then he says, "Are not the Abna and the Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel?" So God's giving him the instruction. He's telling him how he will heal him. Okay, does this remind you of other things? Like, for instance, Moses, when he tells him, go for the water, coming out of the rock, and Moses uses his anger and does something differently. And that's why Moses was punished in Exodus. The same, if you think about it, there's also miracles with Christ. Christ tells, he puts, I guess, water and dirt on someone's eyes, heals them, and tells them to go wash, right? So he's giving him instructions, and this man is very doubtful. 2 weeks ago, I was talking about how back then they were all about physical. They weren't into the spiritual much. Every time a prophet would come and tell them this or this is going to happen, they would ask for a sign that it's going to happen. So Naaman obviously had doubts, and he had trouble following direction. But obviously his servant talks him into, and he's like, we came here, and we should do what he says and see what happens. And Naaman obviously gets healed and returns back to his homeland. But this is a story we need to. Sometimes the signs are right there in front of us. Sometimes the path, everyone says it's a narrow path, it's hard, being on that straight path. Sometimes it's there right in front of us. The answer is there, and we refuse to take it. We come up with these other suggestions in our minds, and we say things like what Naaman said, hey, isn't the rivers back in my country better? Or, we'll come up with other things for, a priest or a bishop or someone might be giving you guidance spiritually, right? And then you'd be like, but isn't what I'm doing already better? Or can't I do something better? Or maybe the priest or the clergy member who gave you advice is giving you that advice because it's tailored to your specific needs, right? Just like this is tailored to Naaman. And Jeremiah puts this story as a lesson for us. The sign is right in front of you. It's right there, and the instructions are right there. And this is the story of Naaman and basically what happens to him. He gets healed. He goes back to his nation. He's very grateful, and goes back to his nation. There is more to the story. One of Elisha's servants. I'm not going to go too much into it. He gets greedy. Elisha wouldn't accept any gifts from Naaman, and Elisha's servant decides to go behind Elisha's back and tell Naaman, oh, my master asked for this and this, and Naaman gives it to him. And basically the servant becomes leprous after that incident. But that's Naaman's story, and that's the point we should be taking from it. Okay, it should be you see the answer in front of you. Someone gives you the answer. You have all these tools. Use them, rather than say, "Oh, isn't this better or that better?" But yes, I'm almost there. I'm sorry. I am almost there. Not for this. No. Okay. Yeah. Jehu becomes king, and when he becomes king, after all this happened, Jehu was given instruction by Elisha that he would go destroy Ahab's family, whatever's left of Ahab's family, his 70 sons and whatever, and get rid of the worshipers of Baal. So, crazy story that happens in the Bible. Jehu goes and tells the 10 tribes of Israel, let's do a celebration for Baal, right? He tells them, let's have a big celebration in his temple, right? Bring all the believers for Baal and make sure they're only believers of Baal. Don't invite anybody else. Make sure all the priests are there and make sure every single one of them is there. And he sticks them into this big temple of Baal, and then he tells his soldiers, if anybody leaves this temple alive, it's your life for their life. He basically takes out all the worshipers of Baal, just as was prophesied by the prophets who were there and before the prophets that were there. Baal and the temple was destroyed. The people killed off. After that, there is a mention in Kings a few times where it mentions, and I'm going to mention this king, Joash. It says he repairs the temple. So during all this time, all these things that are happening, the temple is being neglected. And at the same time, they're building altars to other gods and idols inside of God's temple. The temple where Solomon said, this is where God's going to dwell. It's going to be the house of God. And they're building all these altars. And one of the examples from some of the kings who actually repaired the temples, the kings who followed in God's steps, Joash was one of those kings. And we're going to read about another king. We're going to talk about another king at the end. I'm almost there. But basically, you see this throughout Kings. You see that the temple is neglected. The conversation shifts away from worship to the troubles that these kings are bringing on their people. All right. After all these events with Ahab and whatever, his family and Jehu, because Jehu also sinned by worshiping the calves that Jeroboam built. You know, the calves at the two sections of Israel that Jeroboam wanted people to worship at instead of the temple. Israel was already became condemned by God, and Assyria invades the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes. So there goes a big chunk of Israel, the lands of Israel. Something about Isaiah in chapter 18. So during the time of Isaiah, Assyria was a nation. It was a big nation. Basically, another story Jeremiah put in the books of Kings was that attack from Assyria. A king of another nation decides to boast against God, and he. No, why am I doing? And let's see. And he boasts against God. And he says, now therefore I urge you, give a pledge to my master, the king of Assyria, and I will give you 2,000 horses. And then he says, have I now come up without the Lord against this place to destroy it? The Lord said to me, go up against this land and destroy it. And anyway, at that time, this is another story put there because the prophet Isaiah comes and gives the people a reassurance. He tells them God's not going to abandon you if you walk in his ways. And all the people of Israel at that time are mourning, and they're praying to God, and they're repenting. And basically they are saved per Isaiah. That is the last major event before the kingdom of Israel falls. Okay, after that there's two kings that lead to the fall of the final piece of Israel, which is Judah. Okay, also known as Jerusalem. The first king was Manasseh. Manasseh was actually the reason why Israel was condemned. All of Israel, Judah included. He was a descendant of David, so he was on the throne of David, okay, in Judah. So once his father Hezekiah, which Kings tells us Hezekiah walked in the ways of the Lord, once his father dies, Manasseh becomes king. The first thing he does is he rebuilds the high places. In Kings, Chronicles, and in Judges, you hear about these high places, okay? There's two purposes for these high places, and I'm going to explain what they are. These high places were altars in different locations outside of the temple. They're usually in high places, like in mountains or on top of buildings or whatever. And they had two purposes. They can either be for worshiping God or worshiping idols. Either way, after the temple was built, they were both invalid. Okay, obviously the one worshiping other gods is wrong, but even worshiping God there was wrong because it was prescribed that people go to the temple and worship, or worship in your home. But you want to offer sacrifices, bring them to the temple, because that's where the priests of God served, in that temple. They didn't worship at the high places. So the first thing he does, builds high places that his father Hezekiah destroyed. Doesn't say for who, whether it's God or gods, it doesn't matter. It was invalid either way. He raised up altars to Baal. So now we're getting to the point where, hey, he built these high places, so now it's telling us what altars are there, and obviously it's to Baal. Back then, the Baals, okay, were gods. They were different gods that belonged to the Canaanites, the Sidonians, and a bunch of other smaller nations around Israel. He worshipped all the other gods. He built for them altars in the temple of God. He built altars inside the temple of God where God said, I will dwell here. This is my home. And he built altars for other gods. He practiced witchcraft. All right? Witchcraft is what led Saul to his final, that was his final mistake. Witchcraft. Saul, in the book of Samuel, he dies the next day, him and his son, in a battle with the Philistines. That was his third sin. That was the third sin he committed. He went to a witch, told her, I want to speak to Samuel. Bring him up from the dead. Okay? So, bring his spirit up from the dead. That was Saul's biggest mistake, and Manasseh is repeating it. It's not like he didn't know. This is a king in Judah. So Judah is supposed to be the most holiest, the closest to God, and he's committing sins like this, practices witchcraft. He sacrifices his son, and I actually spoke about the Ammonites 2 weeks ago when I was talking about Judges. He sacrifices his son to Moloch, a god of the Ammonites. Okay, his own son, he puts him in a fire to sacrifice to a god, a deity that was made by hands. Actually, many biblical historians considered Moloch one of the demons of Satan. They believe he's a demon from Satan that works for Satan. He filled the land with blood. He filled the land with blood. And when it says blood, biblical historians actually put this together from other books in the Bible. He killed, there was murders everywhere at his time. Legalized murders. He killed children, babies, you name it. There was death all over Israel. There was blood everywhere, okay? Anybody he didn't like, he killed. And to prove that, which is also kind of a legend, but we're going to get to something that actually speaks about that a little bit. Isaiah, who came and called him out, he basically told Isaiah, who are you? Okay, who are you? All right? And it said that he sawed Isaiah in half. He killed Isaiah by sawing him in half. Okay, that's the legend. All right, the biblical legend. And if you go real fast, and I'm actually at the last part, which is going to be about the final king I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to go to Hebrews real fast. In Hebrews, let me pull this out. Paul actually mentions something about this in Hebrews, chapter 11, verse 37 to 38. He's talking here about what happened to the prophets and the saints. He said they were stoned, They were sawn in two. They were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented. So he's talking about just being sawed in two. So it is a legend that Manasseh, it's a biblical legend, Manasseh sawed Isaiah in half. It is believed amongst most biblical scholars and many of the church fathers. Back to Kings. So Manasseh basically a prophet is sent to him to tell him what's going to happen to Israel. And if you go to Kings, 2 Kings, chapter 21, verse 10, that's where it starts from. And the Lord spoke by his servants, the prophets, saying, because Manasseh, king of Judah, has done these abominations, he has acted more wickedly than all the Amorites who were before him. The Amorites were one of the most vile of nations. And as you read the Bible, the Old Testament, you actually learn more about them. Who were before him, and has also made Judah sin with his idols. Therefore, thus says the Lord God of Israel, behold, I am bringing such calamity upon Jerusalem and Judah, that whoever hears of it, both ears will tingle, and I will stretch over Jerusalem the measuring line of Samaria and the plummet of the house of Ahab. I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. So I will forsake the remnant of my inheritance and deliver them into the hands of the enemies, and they will become victims of plunder and of their enemies. And that happens later on. After Manasseh, there's, I believe, one king, and then after that king comes Josiah. Josiah, a lot of people don't know about Josiah, but if you read the book of Kings and Chronicles, he is one of the greatest kings of Israel. All right? He becomes king at the age of 8. In his teenage years, it is said that he starts learning about the faith and follows in the footsteps of his father David, okay, and following God. At the age of 26, he begins repairing the temple. And inside the temple, this is how neglected the temple was. A priest, at that time, the high priest was Hilkiah. The high priest goes to Josiah and tells him, I found the book of the law, as if you didn't even know about it. That's how neglected the temple became. That's how neglected the faith became. They didn't even have the book of the law. The book of the law is the first 5 books by Moses. All right, and they didn't even have that. So he has someone read it to him. And then he tears his robes. Back in the Old Testament, a king who tears his robes basically is in mourning. It's a king that goes in mourning. And he's mourning about the destruction that Israel is facing, the impending destruction. So he goes to Huldah, the prophetess. Okay, there was a prophetess at that time. Her name was Huldah. He sends messengers to her, and she tells the messengers, because Josiah was very zealous for God, and he's obeying and following God, God will not bring the calamities during Josiah's reign. Okay, Judah will be in peace, basically, during Josiah's reign. At that time, Josiah goes and decides, that's it. All right, enough of this. And this is the final piece where I'm at. He goes and destroys all the temples, the altars, everything belonging to other gods, removes all the stuff they put in the temple to other gods, the temple of God. Josiah was the one, if you remember in the beginning of when I started, I told you about the man of God that went and prophesied to Jeroboam and said to the altar, Josiah is going to burn this altar and the bones of those who worshipped on it. Well, this was King Josiah. He goes to those 2 altars in Bethel and Dan, takes the bones of all the priests that are buried by it, the priests that were worshiping at those altars, and burns their bones and breaks the altars down. That's what Josiah does. He actually fulfills the words that the prophet spoke a few hundred years before him. After Josiah, though, things go downhill, and as we know, Babylon invades Israel, Babylon is one of the biggest empires at the time. It invaded Israel. It destroyed the temple. They basically, Babylon took all the artifacts from the temple. Everything that was left that wasn't ransacked by the other nations, they took it, destroyed the temple, and took Israel into captivity, basically. That's how Kings ends. Basically, all because of the sins which all those kings honestly have committed. All right, almost, I would say more than half of the kings in the book of Kings committed some kind of sins or added to the sins of their fathers in the books of Kings. And so when you read these two books, I recommend that you don't just read them as a history book. Pay attention to the message, and you look at the stories that Jeremiah actually goes into detail about. Okay, and these are some of the stories he goes into detail about, these kings and these prophets. He's writing details about him. Ahab, I was telling you, alone has like 2 or 3 chapters about him. It is a lesson for us to learn. It is a lesson for us to learn from even Jeroboam with his pride and his arrogance and his the idol that he has set up of power. Does anybody have any questions before we end? I know this topic was a little rigorous, and I apologize. It is long because the books of Kings, if we took it from A to Z, it would take a week, all right, honestly, to finish it every night. So, thank you, everyone, and glory be to God forever. Amen.